For at least the second time in his political life, Donald Trump is erroneously calling into question the citizenship of a non-white American running for office. Yesterday, he didn't dispute a debunked right-wing lie flying around social media surrounding Kamala Harris's vice presidential eligibility, wondering aloud if she was even legally permitted to seek that office based on the fact that her parents were immigrants. And it's worth repeating. The allegation that she can't be vice president is a lie. She is indisputably eligible. All you have to do is read the 14th Amendment. For her part, though, Kamala Harris has pointedly avoided talking about that baseless accusation. She has, however, spoken about race more broadly as it relates to the 2020 race. Here's what she told our new MSNBC contributor, Aaron Haynes, about how a woman of color on the ticket affects voter enthusiasm.
When you have one ticket that can say the phrase Black Lives Matter and another who has been full-time sowing hate and division in our country, those are the things that are going to motivate Black women to vote. There will be a point of pride. I don't want to have any false modesty about a Black woman being on the ticket, but it takes more than just that to motivate Black women to vote. People have to speak to their issues, and the Biden-Harris ticket does that.
Joining our conversation, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and president of the National Action Network, Reverend Al Sharpton. And lucky for us, Donna is also still here. Rev, I want to start with you. I'm going to guess you saw that attack coming from a mile away. Is it any different this time around?
It is not any different. And what is the thread here is that Donald Trump either initiates or in some way supports the idea that an American is not an American citizen only when it's dealing with a person of color. Now, he attacks everyone, calls people names, but he never questions the citizenship of people other than blacks or people of color, which shows this whole racist tendency to say we're not true Americans. You can always question whether they are one of us. It's us against them. It is a very clear message that he's trying to send to white voters. They are other than us, therefore they're not really Americans. How can you let them lead the country? And if you go through all of the bitter arguments that he has had with people in political life and all of the public attacks, he only attacks people of color in terms of their birthright. And that is a basic racist instinct.
Donna, it would seem to me that there is a conceit baked into this line of attack, which is normally the way you go after a vice presidential candidate. The sort of biggest hit against them is this person just doesn't have enough experience. We're not sure they can take over on day one. Kamala Harris, AG, U.S. Senator, it is very hard to launch that more substantive attack against her.
Well, the president actually doesn't have that line of attack against Kamala Harris. And so just as usual, there is a through line from the president's racist instincts to the words that come out of his mouth. And in this case, that's been true. And I think, frankly, that Kamala Harris is right to stay focused, stay on message, talk about the broader issues around race, which we know exist. And I think that for President Trump, the more that he does this, I think the more he's going to alienate some of the people that he's going to have on his side, not just the 1/3 of voters that he has, but to add to that to win an election. And I simply do not believe that America is going to go down this line again. He pulls out this sort of birther attack, this racist attack, which is another cog in a playbook that he's used before, and we're all on to it.
Rev, I want to know if you both agree with Donna's assessment about Kamala Harris's decision not to engage in this line of attack. But I also want to know what you think the responsibility of the media is when it comes to this conversation. I mean, do we treat it like disinformation, other disinformation, where we call it out, where we label it as a lie? Or by doing that, do we give it more oxygen? How do you thread that needle?
I think that clearly Kamala Harris is running for vice president, and she ought to run for vice president, deal with the broader issues, and not come down to Trump's level, show herself as someone that is prepared, and I believe she is, and that is qualified to be vice president, and keep moving on. But I think the media has to ignore foolishness, but when it is raised, call it foolishness. And this is foolishness. And remind people, this is the same Donald Trump that did this to Barack Obama, promised a birth certificate that he never delivered, and here we go again. And I think if we're going to deal with it at all in the media, deal with who is saying it and deal with the track record and then move on. But if we fall into the trap, if we bite the bait of him trying to make this a campaign issue, then I think he wins. If we just use it as it is, and that is some ludicrous sideshow that he's used before, then I think that people will look at the real substantive issues that we ought to be dealing with in this campaign, and a guy that doesn't know any card to play but the race card.
Talking about the real substantive issues in this campaign. Donna, I want you to weigh in on some of the sound we heard from Senator Harris earlier, talking about the ways in which having a woman of color, specifically having a black woman on this ticket, will potentially motivate communities of color to come out and vote. What are the issues that the campaign needs to be driving on, in addition to the fact that they have now diversified their ticket?
Well, we do know that that Joe Biden has been challenged when it comes to younger voters, and particularly younger voters of color. And I think that what you saw today in one of these earliest interviews, the first interview, I think, of Kamala Harris, is that she has the ability to speak the language and to give voice to concerns that communities of color have had, and to put it into some context that is both personal and also speaks to these broader populations. And I think that she's going to be an asset to former Vice President Joe Biden out on the campaign trail, drawing in some of these constituencies that just need to be shored up and encouraged that their vote really counts and that she has their voice. I thought it was interesting to see that on this first real day of campaigning, that she was able to speak the language that many of these young people understand and to draw them in. And I think that's only going to be a really strong asset for her and for the Biden-Harris team going forward.
Rev, I want you to listen to one more clip from Erin Haynes' interview with Senator Harris. Take a listen.
Joe Biden had the audacity to choose a black woman to be his running mate. How incredible is that? And what a statement about Joe Biden, that he decided that he was going to do that thing that was about breaking one of the most substantial barriers that has existed in our country, and that he made that decision with whatever risk that brings.
Rev, she calls it a potential risk. Wouldn't it have been just as much of a risk not to put someone like her on that ticket?
I think that if you're trying to draw the vote that you are going to need in terms of turnout of blacks and other people of color, it would have been risky. I was one of the first ones to say publicly I wanted to see a black woman as vice president when he said he would choose a woman. I had him on my show late April, early May on Politics Nation and said it to him. We saw various women's groups. It started building up. Jim Clyburn's came out early. So I think there was risk on both sides. But now in a general election, I think is what Kamala Harris is referring to. In a general election, there is the risk in certain pockets of this country that is more politically risky. And I think that Joe Biden, who is no stranger to politics, understood that. He showed that he would hear the appeal of people, but that he would make rational decisions based on their qualifications. So he did it not bowing to pressure, but saying in a calculation of who can be the vice president, this is the one qualified. I hear you that black women are qualified, and this is one that I feel is the qualified one to go with me. I don't think he would have done it if he didn't think she was qualified, but I don't think we would have raised it if we were not saying black women are qualified.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.